the one of the advantages of the Quran is it came later in the history.
Exactly, yes.
And it's a really small book compared to Vedas. What happens when the Vedas meet the Quran?
And when you say the Muslim mind would think like that, I have to add that many Hindus will also think like this.
In this episode of Thinking Islam, we move beyond conflict and nostalgia to ask, can Bhakti devotion and Sufi love truly speak to one another? And what do they reveal about science, suffering, and the meaning of life?
And Muslims are doomed to remain foreigners. Muslims are doomed to remain some kind of an alien presence who have to be suspected.
In the same poem, he's talking about Prophet Muhammad, and in the end he talks about Ram as a devotee. Joining us is Dr. Ankur Barua, Senior Lecturer in Hindu Studies at Cambridge University and the author of The Hindu Self and Its Muslim Neighbours.
Tension is very much present in Islam as well.
Yeah.
God having God beyond form and yet God expressed through a beautiful form.
His research explores the dynamic intersection between Bhakti, Tawheed and Tasawwuf across South Asia. How would you describe ideal worship in the Hindu tradition? What it is actually? So Dr. Ankur, welcome to Thinking Islam podcast. To begin the journey of exploring the topic, I would like to ask you firstly about your own personal journey. You started as a physicist. You did your bachelor's in physics from St. Stephen's College. And then you moved towards, so you started in science and you moved towards something that many people wouldn't consider as science. So what was the reason? Was physics not enough to satisfy your intellectual curiosity? Why did you move towards theology? What was the reason?
Thank you, Arman, for that very interesting question that has been put to me many times over the last 25 years now. Let me begin by saying that when I was studying physics, I was already interested in questions that lie at the borderlines of physics and metaphysics. So I was interested in dimensions of physics such as quantum physics, quantum cosmology, and so on, where you begin to ask questions about the nature of space-time. Does time have a beginning? Will space have an end? What is real? What is unreal? So even when I was studying physics, one part of my mind was thinking about these questions quite seriously. Now, sometime around that time, my mother died, a very painful death. And that made me think about what is the meaning of human existence. Why is there suffering? Why is there so much seemingly pointless evil? And I began to understand that no matter how much of physics I study, physics will not help me address those questions because these questions are not even raised in a general setting of physics. So that is why step by step I moved from physics to philosophy of science, history of religion, philosophy of religion, and finally, religious traditions of South Asia. So I will not say that I've quite shifted or switched from physics to metaphysics. Therefore, when people ask me this question, why did you shift? Why did you switch from physics to metaphysics? I'll tell them I never switched. I have progressed or evolved. Mm-hmm. So I have evolved on this continuum because I became more interested around the age of 1920 in addressing certain very basic questions of our human existence relating to the meaning of life, the significance of human existence, the purpose. And especially the purpose in a religious cosmos where it seems that there is seemingly so much, as I say, pointless, meaningless suffering, despair, fragmentation. How to fit all of that, all these human experiences into what religious traditions claim. Mm-hmm. They claim that ultimately we are rooted in this transcendental plenitude of being, goodness, value, but I don't see it in front of me. When I walk out into the road, I only see violence and hatred and meaningless violence, ... So how to bring the two things together has been an ongoing struggle in my own life, both as a scholar and as a human being. So that's the one answer to your question.
But as you said that, you mentioned that how different existential questions led you to go towards metaphysics and then towards theology. But science also has answers to those questions, of suffering, of violence, of different things. what was there in the religious answers or in the religious journey or in the theological answers that made you cling on to those answers?
So I think, firstly, before I answer that question, you're right. The point I'm not making is that science cannot provide these answers. I mean, there are certain philosophical perspectives with big names like metaphysical naturalism, which will claim that whatever there is within the bounds of space and time, and all explanations to all kinds of questions can be provided with the categories of space-time. So science does offer answers to these questions. But I think, when you are a young man, 18 years old, 19 years old, it may be the case for some people, not for everyone, that you feel that the fundamental question of the I is left out in scientific vocabularies. Because science usually speaks in third person categories, like this is space and this is time. Here's a third person standpoint analysis of what happens in terms of these equations. But who is the I? Who is the I who is writing these equations? Who is the I trying to understand oneself? Who is the I trying to formulate these questions of physics? That category of the I is usually left out. Now, that may not be a problem for many people. I'm not saying that is a problem in itself. It does not have to be a problem. But for me, it was. For me, it was a problem that the question of the I was not directly addressed and raised. Who am I who is studying physics? Who am I who wants to do this? And I felt that if that is what I'm interested in, I may find some kinds of answers to these kinds of questions in religious texts, in philosophical texts. And I can't promise people that, or rather, I cannot tell people that I have found conclusive, definitive answers to these questions. But religion at least gives you the doorway, the pathway to a different dimension of thinking.
But just to point out, in the sense of the I, the science of psychology has an answer of what I is.
Yeah.
Maybe this I in itself is a thought. There is, in the distinction of, we think that I am thinking, so I is a substance and thinking is a function.
Yes.
But maybe so we cling on to something that is I, that is a substance. And then from this, since this I should have some meaning, I should have some significance, I should have some relevance. And then the religious truth comes in, says that, okay, no, this I is very important. For example, in Islam, this I is actually the Khalifa of God, the purpose of creation. Or in Hinduism, it's the I, the actual I is Atman. So there is always some terms of certainty or some terms of deeper truth to the I, and which gives you some sort of ego boost as well. But there are other answers where the science says that maybe there is no I actually in this sense, and you are just an cosmic accident. So why give so much of a significance? How has this question ever been in your journey, and how have you looked at this question?
Yeah, so to go back to what I was saying, the point I'm making is that it's not that I see the sciences, broadly speaking, and metaphysics and religion and theology, broadly speaking, as sharply opposed. Rather, I think of them as located on a conceptual continuum. So what we may know about the I through the study of psychology does not have to be sharply opposed to what we may know about the I through religious texts. So you say that in the study of experimental psychology, I can also get to know something about the I. But even when I'm studying experimental psychology, I would not, generally speaking, use the language of nafs and ruh and qalb, for example. As I would just say, this mind is a mental substance, or mind is mental becoming or processes. So then I would take something from all these different vocabularies. I would take something from all these different language games. So when I say I'm reading a 15th century, 16th century Hindu or Islamic text about spiritual psychology, I'm not saying that therefore we should not read contemporary experimental psychology. Let's read everything. Let's read everything and triangulate all kinds of wisdom and knowledge we have from different sources and try to develop a worldview of our own, which is what I'm trying to do.
But you have spent most of your time in reading theology and those religious scripture, then doing psychology, if it's about the I question. So what was the reason for the bias of not giving you so much of a time? If the I question is really important, is because also if you go by the scientific narrative actually establishes some sort of equality. So this table is not different from me. I am also a collection of atoms in that sense. I'm just saying in a really a crude sense. So there is no difference between what I am wearing and what I am. because this is also a collection of atoms. There may be some evolution, some gradations, but it's the same. But it's the religious scripture, or sometimes the tradition, some of the religious scriptures, we say that no, you are different from the table because you are the epitome of this, why the world was created. So there is also this bias which is inculcated in how would I say it, an anthropocentric view, where in religious tradition you become the center, but that may not be true in science.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
how do you look at this?
Yeah, so to go back again to what I was saying, so I did not switch from or jump from science to religion straight away. That's why I use these terms like philosophy of science, history of science, philosophy of religion. So I should also have therefore added psychology of religion. So whatever psychological texts from experimental psychology, from cognitive psychology are relevant to the question of the I have spent some time studying them as well. So, but having said all of that, what you were saying is also a good point, that this kind of anthropocentrism, which we find in some theological texts, would place them in opposition to a scientific narrative, which will say that we are all connected seamlessly to the rest of the universe. I would add a footnote to that. In a theological text, this type of anthropocentrism is a kind of theo-anthropocentrism. And by which I mean to say is that the human being is in the center, but only with respect to God, who is the true center.
Okay.
So even when they place humanity at the center, this is at the center of God's vision, not at the center of oneself.
But at the same time, a God who is obsessed with human beings, not with the rest of the creations in that sense.
Well, it depends now on the text and the tradition. There will be text and tradition who will say God cares equally for all plants and beings, animal beings, and the rest of the cosmos. And we human beings are at fault for thinking that God is especially interested only in us. So it depends entirely on the text and the tradition. I mean, I agree. Many of these theological texts do have this very strong dimension of anthropocentrism. But they will also remind you and caution you that too much of anthropocentrism is a kind of hubris, is a kind of pride, is a kind of false conceit. Because they will also say in the same breath, you have to submit yourself entirely to this true center of being. So even as you're talking about anthropocentrism, it is an anthropocentrism that is oriented to one great self that is not you.
So how would you differentiate between, just initially asking, between how, since you have done philosophy of science and you have spent a larger chunk in theology and religion, what's one critical distinction between how science pursues or looks at things and how it's done in theology for your own, in the sense, in your opinion?
Yeah.
It may not need to be necessarily be an academic opinion. It can be a personal opinion as well.
No, I mean, I'll tell you that there are some very clear distinctions between theology on the one hand, or religion and philosophy on the one hand, and a discipline of science like mathematical physics. So when I use the term continuum, I don't mean to say that all these different disciplines of human inquiry are one and the same. We use very different language games when we are carrying out experimental psychology or mathematical physics, and a very different language game when we are doing yoga or meditation or mindfulness. So one very significant, very important difference is this, that science uses the language, the universal language of mathematics. And the language of science is mathematically replicable. So I can tell you that here is a set of equations, and you can verify or falsify this particular theory. Verification or falsification is not always easy, but in principle it can be carried out. And I can say if this theory is true, if it matches the nature of reality, you should get so-and-so as a result. And I can carry out this experiment right now in Birmingham. You can try to replicate somewhere in Brisbane, in Australia, or in Bombay, Mumbai. And we should be able to phone one another or via WhatsApp or something and say, what answer did you get? And my friend there says 3.8. I say, oh, 3.8. We agree. And that's because we speak a universal language of mathematics, which can be, to some extent, verifiable or falsifiable. But spiritual experiences are not of this type. They cannot be so readily verified or falsified, right? Say, for example, I can tell you that if I'm this great yogi or guru, and if you follow my silsila or my sampradaya, my lineage, after 20 years of meditative practice, you will begin to have these particular visions of divinity. Or you will be able to feel a kind of sympathy with the rest of reality. or you will feel that the person you meet on the road is another form of you, and you will have these experiences. And how do you know that you will have these experiences? You will have to come and learn with me. You have to come and study with me, right? So even theological experiences, so to speak, are kind of verifiable, but not in this ready-made fashion where I can give you a quantifiable parameter called 3.8. We all agree universally what you're seeing is a tree in front of you, and the color of the tree is that shade of green. We can arrive at a decisive conclusion in 5 minutes or 5 seconds, or sometimes 5 days. But with spiritual experiences, it's not of this kind, right? I mean, I can't tell God, I can't make a demand on God. God, show me a sign, show me a sign in the sky that you exist. And right there, God says, I exist, you tiny little human being there. You know, I cannot make such demands on the divine power, if there is one, whereas I can make such demands on the natural space-time around me. So that is a very important difference, that the language of science, to repeat and to summarize, is mathematizable, can be written down in the form of differential equations and things like that. And we can all agree, we speak this language.
On this note, in one of your papers on science and religion, there was a quote. It said that about Dalai Lama. I want to know your views also on it, because it's mentioned in your paper. You said that Dalai Lama argued that certain deep truths are not accessible to those without scriptural testimony.
Exactly. So that, by the way, is another contrast, which is that many of these religious and spiritual traditions, they have this category called revelation. You know, and whether we should think of reason and revelation as opposed, as synonymous, as congruent or similar, is an ongoing debate in all these traditions, right? Is it the case that revelation is in continuity with reason, or is it the case that revelation can sometimes sharply negate what you see or what you're able to arrive at as a conclusion through reason? So without going into these debates, what these religious traditions say is that there is a certain body of knowledge which you cannot directly verify or falsify on day one. You just have to accept it with some measure of trust.
On the testimony.
On the testimony. So, for example, suppose I have a Buddhist or a Hindu friend who says that, look, there is no way of directly proving to you that you have been reincarnated in this form because of these karmic pathways. And therefore, you may choose not to accept this account. But if you have trust in the guru as a figure who's kind of semi-omniscient and who has been able to understand the nature of reality, it's a very big if you have this trust. And the Sanskrit word is Shraddha. If you have the Shraddha that the Guru is not just a mere human being, the Guru has some deep insight into how the world works. The world on this account is shaped by all these different karmic pathways. Then I may say to the Guru, okay, on day one, I have Shraddha in you. Although I cannot see with my own physical eyes or my spiritual eye how karma works, I have Shraddha in you that as I progress on the spiritual pathway, hopefully 5 years or 15 years from now, I will have a deeper insight into these truths. And that is the dimension of revelation or shabda, right? I mean, what is heard, like that is what the word shabda literally means, not what is seen or what is perceived with the eye. You tell me the truth, you communicate the truth to me, and the truth is received as a sound, as a hearing. I hear the truth, and hopefully that should generate in me the response of Shraddha. Okay. It may not, but if it does, then in this case, I would say to the Dalai Lama, look, although I do not know how karma works and rebirth works and not self works, these are very complicated things. On day one, you must be speaking the truth. Therefore, I have chosen to follow you.
So in that sense, the scriptural testimony gives us that there is a possibility. And once you follow that, the possibility may be realized.
Yes.
So the scriptural testimony holds that possibility. And it's, in the sense, accessible just because it's in the scriptural testimony. Otherwise, it won't be accessible.
Yeah.
On this notion, you mentioned revelation and you mentioned scripture. So generally, we think that revelations are there in Islamic traditions. We have our Abrahamic traditions. You have Moses, Abraham, and all the other prophets that had revelation. In Hinduism, or I don't know what's the right term, or in Indian philosophy or Hindu philosophy, is there any account of how a possibility of a revelation, or since you also have an idea of how Islamic revelation works, is there any parallel there in the Hindu philosophy or Indian traditions?
Yeah, so whenever we look for parallels across religious traditions, a parallel, we should remember, a parallel consists of two straight lines, which are parallel, but they don't quite meet. That's why they're parallels, right? So when you look for parallels, we should not look for precise equivalence.
Yeah.
There will always be some difference, okay? So in the Islamic tradition and the Jewish and the Christian traditions, we have a whole tradition, a lineage, a silsila, if you will, of prophets starting from Adam all the way to Jesus Christ, the Prophet Muhammad, okay? So we do not quite have that precise equivalent. But there are certain analogs. So just now I have been using the word shabda, or we can use the term shruti, again, that which is heard. So the Vedas and the Upanishads, these ancient texts, which we may, from a historical point of view, date at, say, 1500, 1800 BCE, and about 900 BCE. So these are really ancient texts we're talking about. Now is what? The year is 2025. So we're talking about almost like what? 3,000 years ago, right? Even more than that. So these texts are regarded in the development of Hindu philosophical theological traditions as the revelation. So the claim is that these were not composed by human authors who, let's say, woke up one morning and say, oh, it's time to write a Veda or write an Upanishad. So the claim rather is that these are sages or seers who received these messages from where? Now, that's an interesting question. From the divine source called Brahman. So in the later development of these traditions, the claim is that Brahman has revealed just in the way that we breathe in and breathe out. So through the breathing out of Brahman, the Vedas have arrived, the Vedas and the Upanishads. And they constitute divine revelation insofar as they do not have a human author.
Okay.
So if you ask me, who has composed this Upanishad or that Veda, the traditional answer is that that's a bad question because they were not authored or composed by human beings. That is why the Vedas and the Upanishads are infallible. There is a different category of revelation that is called smriti. And to this category called smriti, certain human authors are ascribed. So the vast epic narratives like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they have certain authors, whether these figures are legendary or historical, but I can tell you, in principle, who composed the Mahabharata, who composed the Ramayana, who composed the Manusmriti and these texts. And the claim is that if there is a conflict between Shruti and Smriti, it is Shruti that gets to override Smriti.
What would be the English translation for Shruti for our viewers?
So Shruti is that which is heard, and this term Smriti is that which is remembered.
Okay.
And what is remembered, as you know, is fallible because human memory is fallible.
Okay,
but what is heard, you cannot get that wrong. What you're hearing from me right now, at this moment, is infallible. I hope you're hearing me clearly.
Really?
But if I ask you tomorrow, what is it that I told you yesterday, you may give me a different answer because you may forget, right? So the point is that whenever something is passed down like this through human memory, there is corruption and contamination. That is why it may not always be correct, absolutely correct. But with Shabda, revelation, that which is heard and received passively, there is no possibility of error. So that is a hermeneutic rule of reading scripture. That is, if there are conflicts between different bodies of scripture, Smriti and Shruti, Shruti gets hermeneutic priority.
In that sense, so are these revelations received by sages or
Indeed.
just one sage?
Yeah, so if you look at this matter historically, of course, it will have to be like individual human beings who were living in what is today northwestern India, Punjab, Pakistan, Afghanistan, that part of India. And let's say all of that, in the Rig Veda, there are, I think, exactly 1,028 hymns. So let's not say all of that was received in 1 second by one human being. Let's say we are talking about groups of people, families that are receiving these messages and becoming inspired to compose this beautiful poetry, what we may regard as religious poetry. And let's say from a historical point of view, these poems, this poetry is being composed across some centuries, between the 15th century and the 12th century BCE. But sometime around the 8th century BCE, these texts called the Upanishads also begin to be composed. And to go back to what I was saying, the traditional Hindu understanding is that all of this constitutes Shruti or Shabda. It is revelation. It is received by the sages in a kind of mystical vision, if you want to speak that language. And what I mean by mystical vision is that you do not wake up one morning and say, okay, time to write this Upanishad. You are a vehicle through which the divine message is being communicated.
But in that sense, how was it preserved?
Yeah.
The question is like, it was heard, but now I read the Upanishads.
Indeed.
So the letters from hearing and then from writing, or being, first of all, was there writing at that time also?
There
That's
was no
only one
writing at that
question.
time, yeah.
So how was this, the whole journey of preserving and making it in text, and then also the text is infallible?
Indeed. I can ask you the same question about the Quran, and the answer you'll give me about the Quran is more or less the same answer here, that young boys were made to learn vast amounts of material, verses. And when I say young boys, I'm not talking about one young boy memorizing the whole thing. So the Vedas were divided into groups. So those of you here, these three, you will learn this part. Those of you four on the other side of the room, you will learn those 8 parts. And so think of it as a cognitive distribution of labor. And you have young people, young boys, 6 years old, 8 years old, because at that time your memory
is fresh,
is sharp.
sharper.
And we're going to memorize huge amounts of text, which is kind of unthinkable in our times, like with social media and Wikipedia.
But the text was written, it means that.
It was not written, it was memorized. It was written as it were in the mind. The mind is also a piece of writing, is it not? Right? So nowadays we have forgotten. We think, you can only write things on paper. You can also write things on your mind. I mean, that's why I started with the example of the Quran. Like these people who memorized the whole Quran, what were they writing on? I mean, they may have had some parchment, but more often than not, they were not too worried about books. They just memorized it, right?
Yeah, but with Quran, the question, it's also one of the advantages of the Quran is it came later in the history.
Exactly, yes.
When writing was available, and it's a really small book compared to Vedas.
Yeah. So again, there are parallels and not. Okay. So that was just an example I was giving you. That how the question about how do you memorize vast amounts of text can turn up in many different contexts. So to go back to what I was saying, very precise rules were laid down to memorizing. And the text was broken up into different fragments, and you could again bring it together back. So certain rules were laid down as to how to memorize texts. And the claim is that the precise Shabda, Shruti, has been transmitted in an unbroken, seamless manner without any corruption, without any contamination to this day. So the claim is, if today you go to a village somewhere in South India and hear one of these Brahmin Pandits reciting the Rig Veda, you are hearing the voice of antiquity in an unbroken, seamless manner. So what was once heard on the plains of the Punjab in 1800 BCE, you are hearing today in December 2025. That is the claim, right? Because of this patterns of memorization, where you write on the mind, you don't need paper. But at some point, they were also written down, not on paper, but on different media, like what would they be written on? Maybe like cloths and like certain other media.
Okay. So in that sense, it was also a religious experience of the sages.
Yes.
And through religious experience. So in that's where there is a parallel between but it's just not the prophet, but the sages, but you can see a parallel.
Yeah.
What would be one essential distinction between the Abrahamic faiths, the revelation, and the Shruti in case of the Vedas or the Vedanta Upanishads?
Well, I mean, one can think of many different distinctions. One distinction that would come to mind is that, let's say, again, here one has to be careful not to highlight the distinctions too sharply. But broadly speaking, let's say in the Abrahamic traditions, there's a clear line of Shruti, of revelation. So if I ask you from a Christian point of view, how many Gospels are there? There are 4 standard Gospels. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. You cannot today say, I felt deeply inspired by Jesus Christ to come up with my own gospel. No, it's too late now. It's 2025. That time is gone. So the canonical Gospels are only 4. Without highlighting this distinction too sharply, let's say the Hindu traditions in general work with a slightly more broader category of Shruti and revelation. So in principle, if I feel that I have been deeply inspired by Brahman, the divine reality, to write my own commentary on the Vedas. I can tell my disciples that, look, here is the proper way to read the Vedas and the Upanishads, and this is the true meaning of the Vedas and the Upanishads. I can write my own commentary, and I can form my own silsila. I can form my own tradition. So in that sense, the category of revelation is slightly more malleable in Hindu traditions. I say slightly more because, again, once you start looking at particular examples, it may be the case, it may not be the case. But I'm just giving you a 20,000 feet overview of one distinction where in Islam, in Christianity, you cannot say, well, I'm going to write my own scripture because that time has passed, as I say. Whereas in principle, in Hinduism, if you are a guru who has lots of religious charisma and who is able to attract disciples to you, and you are deeply knowledgeable about scripture, you can write your own commentary, form your own group or community, and write and say, this is the new Shabda, this is the new revelation for 2025.
Well, would that be Smriti or Shruti? No, that would be Shruti.
So you will not claim it is Smriti, will you? Because if you are one such guru, you will claim this is Shruti.
Yeah,
right.
But there will be no addition to Vedas in that sense.
Yeah. So what you are not claiming is that you are writing a new Veda. What you're claiming is that this is the true message of the Vedas that was not properly understood till December 2025. And that's why I say the distinction should not be highlighted too much. Because here also, the claim is not that you write a new Upanishad. The claim is that you tell the world what is the true meaning of the Upanishad. But on that note, just to quickly finish this, suppose I ask you how many Upanishads are there. One standard answer is that there are 10 or 11. On a different account, there are as many as 108.
108.
So just that shows what? That the category of revelation is somewhat fluid, right? The point is not that just about anyone can come around and say, okay, here's a new Upanishad. I mean, you will need to have certain qualifications. And, as I say, you have to be learned in the Vedas and the Upanishads, speak a certain kind of theological language, need to have lots of spiritual charisma and all of that. But provided you have all these requirements, you can say such things. I mean, nobody will say this is ruled out. That move is possible in that language game.
Oh, but in the sense, would there be a restriction of language? Should the new message be in Sanskrit or it can be in any language?
So again, those complications will always be there. You should ideally speak some Sanskrit because, as we know, whatever is said in Sanskrit sounds profound, just as whatever is said in Arabic and Latin sound profound, right? So if you are going to speak only in Hindi or a local vernacular, then you may not be regarded as truly authentic. So at the very least, you should be able to recite some shlokas or verses from the Upanishads. But on the other hand, if you cannot speak one of the local vernaculars, then you do not have much of a chance because nobody will understand you, right? So you have to speak a local vernacular like Tamil or Gujarati or Marathi, and you should have some measure of understanding of the Vedas and the Upanishads in Sanskrit. And provided you are able to make this transition or translation of Sanskritic knowledge into the local vernacular, then you have a good chance of becoming a successful guru who has come up with a new Shabda.
Interesting. Yeah. So taking the note from Upanishads is that one of the perceptions generally, I don't think generally, but this is what if you'd also allow me, is that whenever from a Muslim perspective, Hinduism is looked at, it's looked upon as an idol worship or as polytheism. That's the general perception. But once you go in Upanishads, the one you quoted from Badhinyaka Upanishad also how, and even in Kena Upanishad, there is this monotheism. So first of all, before we go to monotheism, how would you describe ideal worship in the Hindu tradition? What it is actually to a Muslim audience, if it's allowed?
So you have put two questions to me, and in that order. What is idol worship? What is monotheism? Can I please change the order and start with monotheism?
Yeah, please.
Because that is much, much more straightforward. Many people, especially Muslim audiences, may think, no, how can it be more straightforward? But it is. So the question is, do Hindus worship multiple gods and goddesses? Now, that question really depends on the vantage point. Are you asking this question as a philosopher, theologian, or as a social anthropologist? So, if you are a social anthropologist or cultural anthropologist and go and do field work in different parts of India, it may look like the Hindus you meet on the ground are worshipping many different gods, because the ritual calendar of Hinduism will say, okay, on the 15th of September, there is a festival for this deity. On the 2nd of October, festival for this deity. On the 9th of November, festival for this deity. And it looks like these are different deities. But if you look at what is called polytheism from a scriptural perspective, from a philosophical, theological perspective, what the scriptures say, then it is quite clear that these different Hindu traditions are different variations on what we would recognize as monotheism. So the claim is that all these different deities, gods and goddesses, are so many different expressions or manifestations of one foundational principle beyond number, beyond division. And yesterday at the talk, I showed you that particular narrative dialogue from an Upanishad called the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the great forest Upanishad. And this Upanishad is usually dated at about 800, 700 BCE. So it's very important to note the time. It's really an old Upanishad. And there's a person who goes to a sage and says, how many gods are there? Deva is the word that is used. And the number they start with is 3,306. So that is the proverbial Hindu polytheist who worships 3,306 gods. But the person is not satisfied and says, well, how many gods are there really? And there's a drastic drop. I can't remember the exact number. I think something like 33. And it comes down to 1.5, 6. It comes down to 1.5. And finally, how many gods are there? One, Eka, right? So this idea that the foundational principle of divinity is not subject to division, cannot be enumerated. Is it 3 or is it 4? That, it is beyond divisibility. Is very much present in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and in a slightly later Upanishad, possibly, we find a very famous statement which is repeatedly invoked in Hindu religious philosophy, that in the beginning there was one, only one, without a second, right? So in the fundamental heart of divine reality, there is no division, there is no multiplicity, there is no plurality. So the big question that comes up in Hindu philosophical theology repeatedly is that the world we live in is populated by diversity. There are 4 laptops in this room, there are 20 cars in this village, there are 500 human beings in this town. So how has this multiplicity been expressed by this principle of absolute unity? But we won't go down that line, but just to tell you that the question of monotheism is can be addressed fairly straightforwardly. Many Hindus today, they belong to these traditions called Vaishnavism and Shaivism. And Vaishnavas and Shaivas are absolute monotheists. There's no doubt about that at all. If you go and ask a Vaishnava, Hindu, like who is Vishnu, you will get this answer. The one singular source, a destination, and foundation of all reality is Vishnu and Vishnu alone. So all these gods and goddesses that populate the ritual universe of Hinduism are so many devotees or servants of Vishnu. So Vishnu is the ultimate Lord, the ultimate master. And if you are in your ignorance worshipping a lower deity, you are ultimately, without realizing it, worshipping Vishnu. So let's say I worship a certain deity called A and B and C without knowing that the true source is Vishnu. So I think I'm worshipping A, B, and C, but in truth, because the true master of A, B, and C is Vishnu, I'm worshipping Vishnu without realizing it. And for Shaiva Hindus, that ultimate source, the foundation of being, goodness, and value is Shiva. There is no second god on the metaphysical horizon. So that question is very easily, I would say, can be addressed. The question of what is idol worship is a much more difficult question. If you want the very long answer, some years ago I published a blog article in a journal called in the online accessible journal called Renovatio. It is a journal maintained by this college in California called Zaytuna College, and that's a long answer there. But the short answer is this. So as you can see, I'm taking a deep breath because it is not quite easy to tell you what the short answer is in a few words. Hindu traditions will tell you that if you have constructed with human hands a so-called idol, which is say 5 inches tall, made of stone or wood or glass, that stone idol, by definition, cannot contain the absolute infinity of Brahman. because Brahman by definition is beyond space, beyond time. And in the Upanishads, again, we find repeated disclaimers in the style of what is called negative theology. Not this, neti, neti, na iti, na iti. So Brahman is not in space, Brahman is not in time, Brahman is not subject to decay, Brahman is not subject to form and matter, dot, dot, dot. There's a long series of disclaimers.
How would you translate Brahman as? What is the word for our audience? What was the word Brahman?
So the reason why I'm not translating Brahman again directly into English, because it depends on the tradition, but very roughly think of Brahman as divine reality.
Okay.
Brahman is the absolute divine reality, which is beyond divisibility, which is beyond numeration, beyond fragmentation, dot, dot, dot. And the claim is that when one is constructing a certain image or an icon, or the term is murti, of stone or brass or steel, the claim is not that the absolutely infinite Brahman has been squeezed into that tiny little object. But we can think of this tiny little object as a manifestation, as a concrete manifestation of an aspect of Brahman. So one standard argument you will hear among Hindus who use certain images of the deity is that you cannot think of the absolute infinity of God, because your human mind cannot possibly comprehend God's great majesty. God is not in space, not in time. God does not have a human-like bodily form and so on. Therefore, to have a sense of God's presence, you need to have a concrete focal expression, and that image or that murti becomes a channel through which the divine presence is being mediated to you. So in one sense, this very phrase that we use, image worship, is misleading, because when you hear the word or the phrase image worship, you will think, oh, that particular image is being worshipped. But actually that phrase image worship does not mean that the image is being worshipped, but God is being worshipped through the mediation of the image. So ultimately what is being worshipped is God, but you may wish to show respect to God, let's put it this way, through the mediation of that object in front of you. Now, what I've said is, I repeat the short answer, because there are all kinds of footnotes and endnotes to this short answer I have given you. But I think that should do for now, for starters. But if you have any queries about my short answer, I can take up those tangents.
It's just in that sense, Muslim mind thinking, they would say that in the sense as, why would you need, if you have the divine reality, you can just show devotion and respect to it. Why would you need something created off a stone or something created off wood or anything? Why would you need this mediation?
Yes.
What's the background behind it?
And when you said the Muslim mind would think like that, I have to add that many Hindus will also think like this. So what I've given you now is one type of Hindu understanding of the image. There's a different type of Hindu understanding of Brahman, which is absolute nirguna, beyond all qualities whatsoever. And that understanding of Brahman would indeed say exactly what you said. That if Brahman is everywhere, if Brahman is contained in the sky, in the cosmos, in the rivers, in dot, 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 why would you need to construct such an image? So that is an ongoing debate within Hinduism. Whether or not you need a murti to have a sense of the divine presence. Some Hindus would say yes. And some of these Hindus who would say yes, they will also add this qualifier. They would say, actually what is happening is not that I have constructed this image. Rather, I have recited certain mantras and I have invited God to temporarily inhabit this image. So what I have not done is that I have, as to repeat my point earlier, that I have somehow contained God within a finite object. I have recited certain mantras and I have invoked God to make this finite object a temporary habitation of the divine presence. And that's why in many of these Hindu festivals, what happens is that after 5 days of the festival or 9 days of the festival, do you know what is done to the image?
Surgeon.
It is set away. It is sent away because of that reason. Because what has happened in these 9 days is that this finite object constructed with human hands is only a finite mortal habitation of the divine presence. And if you do not set it away on the river, or if you do not burn it, then you are claiming that you, a finite human being, have completely captured once and for all the divine presence in a finite object. So all I'm saying here is that there are complications in the Hindu understanding of the Murti. I would be very surprised myself if I ever met a Hindu who says that, look, here is the stone object in front of me, and I think this stone object is Brahman full stop, without any footnotes and endnotes. So even when Hindus would defend the use of murtis or icons or images as part of their spiritual practice, be ready to hear a long series of footnotes and endnotes. There are all kinds of qualifiers as to what exactly that is and is not.
Yeah, it generally happens that sometimes we paint the whole canvas with just one brush and we think that there is just idol worship and there's just one opinion. But as you also mentioned, that there's whole strain of thoughts, whole debates that are already existing there in the Hindu tradition.
So just to add to that, I think really what we should do, we should have a proper conversation about the meanings of idol, not one meaning, different meanings of idol within different lineages of Islam, different traditions of Hinduism. And then we may find very interestingly that some Muslims have a closer resonance with the Hindu understanding of Murti than some other Muslims.
Okay, so can you elaborate a bit on this?
So I mean, if you want me to use standard names like Deobandis and Barelvis, for example, I have many Deobandi Muslim friends, some Barelvi Muslim friends. And when I have this triangular conversation about whether or not we need concrete signs of God's presence in our lives, I get very different answers. So Deobandis would be generally very anxious about the idea that you were highlighting a while ago, that if God is absolutely formless, beyond form, beyond matter, beyond space, why do you need any concrete signifier? Whereas some other Muslims will be more okay. They may not necessarily endorse these practices, but they will be much more hospitable with the idea that some people may need a concrete sign or signifier. And the reason why I told you a while ago that some Hindus themselves would disagree with this claim is just to highlight the significance of this triangular conversation. So what may look like in the beginning as a contrast between Hinduism and Islam turns out, on careful study, a multi-level conversation debate going on within Hinduism, going on within Islam, and therefore there are all these very interesting cross-religious dialogues and parallels. Some Hindus may be more, say for example, those Hindus who think that they do not need images of any kind. You put them in one room with some of my Deobandi Muslim friends, they will be perfectly all right. They will have no problem. And these Deobandi Muslims may even be surprised. Wow, there are such Hindus. We've never known you, right? So that's what I mean.
Interesting. Hopefully, the link to that article also for a long answer will be in the description. And just have to move to the next phase. You spent a lot of time in doing Hindu theology, philosophy. Then you decided to write a book on the Hindu self and its Muslim neighbors. This is the book. I have the book in the sense of what was the reason for this, then another shift of exploring beyond just the philosophy, but also going to Muslim neighbors. What was the reason?
So in one sense, my personal engagements with Islam go all the way back to when I was around 5 years old, 6 years old. I grew up in this multi-diverse environment with some Muslim friends and acquaintances. So really, the title of this book is My Hindu Self and My Muslim Neighbors, but you cannot write a book with such a title. So it is The Hindu Self and its Muslim Neighbors. So for about 3 decades now, I have been directly, indirectly engaging with Islamic theology, Muslim cultures and civilizations, the location of Islam in South Asia. These are all questions that are of deep importance and significance to me, not just as a scholar, as a human being too. Because as I said, I have had Muslim friends at different stages of my life, and I've been very interested to learn about Islamic theology and Muslim ways of living and looking at the world and so on. So this book developed out of my previous book. Some years ago, I had written a book on the Bengali poet-thinker Rabindranath Tagore. And when I wrote that book on Rabindranath Tagore, there's a small section on Tagore's engagements with Muslims. But I did not pursue that line of thought too far because, you have to write a book within 90,000 words. But the fact that I had not pursued that line of thought kept on coming back to me. Okay, what exactly was Tagore saying and thinking? So then I had some time during 2025, summer of 2025, 5 years ago, and I started reading Tagore's writings on Muslims. And I was quite surprised uh, to see how much he had written on the Hindu-Muslim question in Bengal in the 1920s, 1930s. And then via Rabindranath Tagore, I came to know about this other figure called Nazrul Islam. Well, I mean, I had known about Nazrul Islam earlier too, but not not quite on this pathway. Then I read some of Nazrul Islam's writings in Bengali, and through Nazrul Islam, I came to know another figure called Annoda Shankar. And then I realized that what these people were doing, they were grappling with questions of Muslim being and Muslim existence in a Hindu majoritarian context. And that is an ongoing question that Muslims have engaged with over the last 150 years in South Asia in many different forms. So these personal and existential and scholarly strands came together when I was writing this book. I started writing this book not thinking I was writing a book. I just started translating some of Tagore's writings on Muslims. As I said, I just wanted to know what he is saying. And one thing led to another. And before I realized it, I had a book. So this is a book that I never quite intended to write in one sense, but I'm happy that I wrote it.
Okay, interesting. But what's the point that you are making by putting this book forward?
Yes.
What is the point?
So
Why
the point
is
I'm
it
trying to
important?
make is the final point that I made in the lecture yesterday, that whenever we talk about Hindu-Muslim relations in South Asia, it seems that we only have two sharply opposed viewpoints. One is the viewpoint that yesterday I referred to as demonization, this idea that Muslims are doomed to remain foreigners. Muslims are doomed to remain some kind of an alien presence who have to be suspected. And this is something that we find not just in South Asia, but in any type of majoritarian, minoritarian dynamics. And this is again something I've realized over the years, that a minority always bears a disproportionate amount of the burden of proving that they belong. I mean, whoever is the minority could be Hindus in this country, for example. So if you're in a minority, there will always be this pressure put on you. Okay, show to us that you also belong, that you also matter. Whereas the majority is not worried about it because by definition they belong. I mean, that's why you're the majority. So that is what I refer to as demonization, that always put the spotlight on the minority, in this case Christians in India, South Asia, and Muslims in India, South Asia. But you can have the diametrically opposed view that, Muslims and Hindus have been best buddies forever. We write poetry, such beautiful ghazals, and we make music, Hindustani classical music. We wear the same sherwani and Punjabi kurta and all of that. Whenever there is Eid, I will invite my Muslim friends will invite me for iftar and all of that, and they will come and celebrate some Hindu festivals. There is no problem as such. I mean, that representation is much better than the first one. But the problem with this kind of romanticization is that it forgets that Hindus and Muslims are still now divided by some very powerful fault lines of socio-economic asymmetry, socio-political hierarchy, socio-cultural hierarchy. So what I wanted to do in this book is to show how three very important Bengali intellectuals between 1850 and 1980 were grappling with this via media, with the third space. Third space where we do not have this kind of demonization of Muslims or minorities, nor do we have this kind of romanticization of Muslims, where a kind of romanticization you may sometimes find in Hollywood or Bollywood movies, where you just put in a ghazal and say, oh, this is such a nice ghazal, that means that we are best friends. I mean, once you go out of that context of the ghazal, well, you are back to the real world, right? And these are people who are living through those very troubled times. We're talking about the partition of British India in 1947 and the foundation of Bangladesh in 1971. So they are looking at history with their open eyes. And they are lamenting the fact that these relations of human friendship, these bonds are breaking down in front of their eyes. And one very common theme that they use is what we may call a religious humanism. And Nazrul and Annoda and Tagore are developing this type of religious humanism from their own Hindu and Indo-Islamic contexts. So they're using the language of the Upanishads, using the language of the Qur'an.
What would we mean by religious humanism?
By religious humanism, I mean a humanism that is developed by using religious language, to put it in very simply. So, say for example, Rabindranath Tagore, he frequently uses a verse from a certain Upanishad which goes like this: they who see the Atman, and by Atman we mean the spiritual essence, they who see the Atman in everyone and everyone in the Atman, they have no hatred or anger or hostility towards anyone. Right? So to repeat, they who see the Atman in everything and everything in the Atman, they who see the spiritual continuity that pervades all reality, and all reality in the heart of the spiritual continuity, will not have any hatred or revulsion towards anything. And a lot of his, what we may refer to as his political theology or social philosophy, is grounded in that verse from the Upanishads. And that is his religious humanism, that Hindus and Muslims are, of course, shaped by many kinds of differences and distinctions, but they share a certain spiritual essence. Whatever language you want to use, you may use the language of the Atman or Brahman or Fitra, whatever is the language you want to use. And that realization of our common spiritual essence should be concretized in the real world. So I should look at you not just as a Muslim neighbor or as a hostile enemy, but as an expression of the deep spiritual essence, which binds you and me and the trees and the dogs and the cats and the sky. And Nazrul Islam is developing it through his own language from, as I said, from the Qur'an and Hadith, and he is very deeply immersed in Persian poetry as well. So he's translating a lot of this Persian poetry into Bengali. And through these different moves, they are trying to create a religious humanism, and they lament in their writings that we do not see this religious humanism being preached by those very people who claim to practice it. Right?
Interesting. As you mentioned, that this notion of Muslim being foreigners, there is also a colonial aspect to it, in the sense that the Britishers, they had to justify their place being there in India. So they said, we are not the first one to come. Even the Muslim foreign rule also came in. And the distinction between Hinduism and Muslim is also, the way it's formulated has a colonial hangover, because when we see that, even I think you have also mentioned in it, your introduction, and there are other works also, they say that the very definition of what it means to be a Hindu after the colonization was what is not a Muslim. Because even in the colonial framework, the Sikhs, the Buddhists, and the Hindus are different, but how they were put in one category. And the category was they are not Muslims. So now that defined the very relation, because once if the essentiality of Hinduism is that what who is not Muslim, then you have already made that strong wall, and which has a colonial hangover. But in pre-modern time, or as you said, the majority minority, or even during the Mughal time, in your own reading, do you see such kind of distinction in even adopting? Because what you mentioned in your books, for example, Darashuko, he says that even Upanishads is the hidden book, the Kitabul Maknoon in the Quran, or you mentioned about Wahid Bilgrami, how he reveres Krishna and at the same time Prophet Muhammad. So we see that coherence there. How would you look at this phenomena?
Yeah, so you were right in mentioning how some of this type of categorization, some of this type of homogenization and categorical essentialization is largely, or to some extent, the product of British colonial interventions, such as the census reports, which begin to be produced from 1881.
Yeah.
So let's say 500 years ago, in 1525, there were Hindus and there were Muslims, and there were more Hindus numerically than Muslims. But what we did not have in 1525, a precise sense of those numbers.
Okay.
Right? So if you and I are living in a small village and you are a sheikh, let's say, and I'm a Hindu farmer, then you are still somehow other to me, because you maybe speak a certain kind of language, dress in a certain type of way. But I do not know how many of me are there in this whole land called India or South Asia. Once we have these numbers, then the politics of numbers begins to develop its own kind of logic, right? And therefore, what was life like in 1525? I mean, frankly, I don't know. And I would really like to know. The main problem that I have, if I want to know this, is that I do not read many of the texts. I mean, I have to read some of these texts in Persian, And by text in Persian, I don't just mean text written by the great Mughal emperor, also by local people to their friends. Let's say there's a text saying, oh, there is a Muslim in the nearby village. I think this guy is suspicious. Now that, if there's such a letter written in Persian, that will reveal to us something of the social history, right? So I would say that even in Mughal times, there were certain types of exchange between Hindus and Muslims. But again, one should not romanticize it. One should not say, oh, those were beautiful times we lived in before the British arrived and they spoiled the whole story. We were getting along just fine. Because, the way I look at human history, not just in South Asia, anywhere, is that human history is always this narrative of competition for resources. And we are finite mortal beings living on a planet with resources that are not absolutely unlimited. Therefore, we human beings, this is the sad history of our human race, we come up with just categories of race, of caste, of lineage, of religion, and we try to divide these resources and keep some of them to us. So I'm pretty sure that the Mughal era was not any different from ours. So they had their own structures of hierarchy, own politics, of legitimization. So just that one should not demonize the Mughals, of course, and of course that goes without saying. One should not again romanticize them and saying, this was a beautiful land of Hindu-Muslim unity and brotherhood.
Not going into those extremes, but we still find that which is, I think, I don't know what to call the current world, whether it's modern or postmodern, but the distinction are far more rigid, even in terms of devotion. For example, you also mentioned in a book that Rabindranath or Rabindranath Tagore, they were inspired by poetry of Rumi and Hafiz. And then you see even in the works of Qazi Nazrul Islam, in the same poem, he's talking about Prophet Muhammad, and in the end he talks about Ram as a devotee to Ram, or even as you mentioned, the Sayyid Sultan or Mir Abdul Wahid Bilgrami. So these were the Muslims who were talking about being devoted not just to their tradition, but their devotion also had a space of taking on what there is in other tradition. And then similarly, you have people in the Hindu Rabindranath, or you have Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who kind of studied Persian and then had whole inclination towards the unity. So there was a sharing of devotion, which you don't see currently in today's world in such a way. How would you look at it?
Yeah, so before answering your question, it's very good you mentioned Raja Ram Mohan Roy, because a while ago when I was saying that some Hindus would have a problem with this thing called image worship, Ram Mohan Roy had a major problem with image worship. His first book was called Tuhfat al-Muwahhidin, a gift to the monotheists, and that was written in Persian with an Arabic preface or the other way around. I can't remember which one it was. So anyway, Raja Ram Mohan Roy is a very important person. So what I would say is that I think in every generation, every decade even, definitely every century, there are always two social forces at the very least. One force likes to speak in the language of certainty, likes to speak in the language of A is B and B is C, therefore A is C. They want to know what is what. They want to know how to do things. They want to know how the world works and everything, So they think in terms of specific categories. There is a different force which sometimes runs parallel to it, sometimes directly intersects with it, that lives on the margins, on the peripheries. And you can think of this force, the second force, as a force of creative ambiguity. It lives in these spaces where answers are not always given or laid down in a clear-cut manner. And the people we are talking about, at least in my book, are people who, for various different reasons, inhabited these spaces of creative ambiguity. Now, in many parts of South Asia, not just in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh too, these spaces of creative ambiguity are shrinking and diminishing, because of various kinds of top-down majoritarian forces. And I think what is very important in every generation is to rethink this idea of this middle space. Because I think that the middle space has always this creative potentiality, this possibility of rethinking visions, rethinking these big questions of humanity. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going to? So I will not be too pessimistic by saying that the third space is going to completely vanish. Because one never knows. Another 10 years from now, we may be looking at a very different pattern in South Asia. Maybe we will have a new new vision suddenly arriving. Because, I mean, when you look at the recent past, the 1980s across the world was a very different decade from the 1990s.
Yeah.
Was it not, right? And it's a very different decade from the 1960s. So if that is so, we should not think that where we are today in 2025 is the final word of history, right? If we keep on working on the space of creative ambiguity, we may still be able to turn the tide.
Hopefully. And as you mentioned, this even reading their works, we see that there is some sort of, these boundaries are not that rigid. So sometimes we think that maybe this ambiguity, pre-modern ambiguity, was much more of a much more higher spiritual wisdom than the modern clarity of rigid boundaries that we have. Because as there's this also tradition of which you have also talked about yesterday, is on devotion and bhakti, how the Krishna Bhakti started the Bhakti movement. And then you see in similar traditions going on in the Muslim world as well, the same language. So, for example, usually in the Islamic tradition, the devotee doesn't change their gender while expressing their devotion to God. But in Amir Khusro or Baba Farid, Bulle Shah, you have this bridal, which you also talked about, this bridal mysticism, this devotional love, where you see that they also worshipping their God, but in a more of a gopi style. And that has given birth to so many poetries and so many traditions. How would you, if you want to comment on this aspect of this thinning of the boundaries?
Yeah. So, yesterday I gave a full lecture running into 40 minutes. I mean, which only shows how much there is to talk on this theme. How the language of bhakti has often, has sometimes acted as a symbiotic tissue of translation across some of the Hindu and Indo-Islamic contexts, where in some of these bhakti traditions, the human soul, the human self, is regarded as this feminine or feminized entity, which has to devote itself entirely, wholeheartedly, single-mindedly. And these are very important themes in bhakti. You cannot have two minds about bhakti. You cannot be like, oh God, I'm doing this, but can I please have a car in return? Can you please give that to me? That is not how bhakti is supposed to work. You wholeheartedly, single-mindedly, with single focus, single attention, submit yourself to God, because God is your true breath, your true essence, your true vitality, ... And how to cultivate this sense of dependence on God is the big question in many of the bhakti contexts. And therefore, you can see why so many of the Sufi silsilas in pre-modern India, they found the language of bhakti very similar to their own practices of spiritual psychology, of how to develop the habit of steadfast submission to God, how to become victorious over the nafs, how to develop the virtues of the qalb, how to become a salik, how to become a wayfarer, all the stages and stations, all this language. I think for many of the Sufis, they would have thought that, this land called Hindustan we have arrived at, it has all this language ready-made for us, because it is speaking in a very similar way for a very different reason. I mean, the point is not that the Sufis are talking about Krishna and Vishnu and that very complex theology rooted in the Bhagavata Purana, Bhagavad Gita. No, it's a very different language
aspect.
Game. But the spirit of submission to the true beloved, to the true friend who may turn up in the form of a murshid or a peer to guide you to the great God. So this is a theme that is reflected in this book as well that you have pointed out just now, and I can talk about it more, but I think I will stop there.
Interesting in the sense, we also, so in how this different romantic story, for example, Radha Krishna, then you have Hiranja, then you also have Yusuf Zulekha being taken out by, in many Hindu texts, you have the story of Yusuf Zulekha, even some Sanskrit literature. So you see how these boundaries, how this devotional language gave space to that creative freedom. And then you had, even in current generation, you had many Muslim Qawwali singers singing the songs of Mirabai, the very famous Sanson Ki Mala. So with the Muslim devotion, Muslim man singing a voice of a feminine Hindu woman.
Yeah.
And you see, so in that sense, then you have the synthesis in forms of figures like Kabir or Nanak, which different traditions claim to be, for Kabir, they say he was a Muslim, or even for Sai Baba, the Muslims say that he was a Muslim guru, then Hindus say. So there was that space as well. If I would want to know your views, because that are there in the book of how the synthesis came together in some personalities.
Yeah, so again, like I would say, and all the figures you were talking about, like Kabir and they found themselves in those spaces. That is not to say that those spaces were necessarily celebrated by their contemporaries. People like Kabir were sharply criticized by their own contemporaries.
Yeah.
But just to give you one example of, from our own times, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, in his very popular rendition of Amir Khusro Zehal Miskin, somewhere in the middle, he talks about Mirabai. There's a couplet from Mirabai where Mira says that my true doctor is Krishna, and unless my true doctor Krishna comes to me, I will not be healed. So this is his famous rendition of Zehal Miskin. Why is Mirabai there? We may ask this question, right? We can go back to Nusrat and ask him. I mean, now it's too late, of course, but then why did you sing about Mirabai there? So I would say that, the reason why I'm talking about Nusrat and not about Kabir is just to give you a contemporary example of what I mean by creative ambiguity. It can still be replicated in our own times. I mean, if you wish to do it.
It again goes to, as you mentioned about ambiguity, in the Quranic chapter 3, we also have that some of the verses are clear and some of the verses are ambiguous, and ambiguity has its space.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, we had different, we have a female poet called Lalded who was from Shaivite tradition, and then also the Muslim revered her as a saint as well.
Yes.
So on this aspect of devotion, we see that you have this distinction between the subject of love, the subject who loves, and the object of love. And sometimes that can become a barrier in terms of the other thought, where you have to destroy the self-identity, or one path of Sufism. So is there a tension also in the Hindu tradition as well, what we have here? Because some would say that these narratives of devotee, devotion, or loving God as a human person is not very, is a very, an impious way to do it. The better way is to remember God without any attributes, without any of these things. This is just polluting the mind and bringing God lower. This is the language of devotion.
Yeah. So to go back to that earlier contrast I was talking about regarding the big question about whether we need images in approaching God, this big question is part of the other question. Should we use the language of devotion at all? Because if you're thinking of God as a personal presence, if you're thinking of God as some kind of super person, then you are making God into a finite object. Therefore, you should take this pathway of Nirguna Brahman, God beyond categories, God beyond qualities, God beyond form, God beyond rupa, and all of that. So yeah, I mean that debate is very much present in different Hindu traditions. That is whether God is the beloved friend or God is the beloved silence. That is, God is this absolute, ineffable silence, so that in the face of divinity, you cannot even call out to God and say, God, my beautiful lover or my great friend. This kind of personal category is not to be used. And that is an ongoing debate for at least 2,000 years in Hindu religious history. I mean, you'll find different Hindus having different views on this question. So one reason why I talk about bhakti usually in this context is because the language of bhakti, to some extent, has stronger resonances with certain aspects of Islam. Again, you can see the language I'm using. Certain aspects of Islam, not Islam full stop.
So what were the certain aspects of Islam for you that you found quite interesting, given your angle of bhakti?
So I think, again, going back to my childhood when I was learning a lot of devotional music and poetry, a lot of this kind of Muslim Sufi devotional music is what deeply attracted me into these forms of Islamic theology. So that was my first encounter, as it were, with the multiple universes of Islam. Then, of course, I realized that Islam, like any other religious tradition, has multiple aspects, dimensions, levels, and layers. But if I tend to talk more about Bhakti and Sufi interfaces, that is partly a reflection of my own initial engagement with Islam. But of course, there are also dimensions of Islam which, we don't talk about God having form, but we talk about the beautiful God. We talk about God's beauty, but God's beauty cannot be concretized in a form. So that presence is that uh, tension is very much present in Islam as well.
Yeah.
God having God beyond form and yet God expressed through a beautiful form. So you have to situate somewhere in the middle between these two statements.
Yeah, for that we have Sheikh Arif's theory of essence and form. Hopefully, I'll send you an article on that, and maybe that can add up to this. On this notion, I want to ask you, what's one thing in the Muslim or Islamic tradition that you find very perplexing, or something that you still can't wrap your head around? If there is something, if you want to share with us.
Well, I would not say perplexing, but not in that sense, because I'm not quite a good person to put that question to, because as I said, I've been engaging with many different forms of Islam for many years, talking to Muslims, reading books, speaking to colleagues. But I will not say perplexing, but I would say maybe it's a bit strange. Again, depending on the Muslim figure I have in mind, which is this, that if we do talk about God's omnipresence, if we do talk about God being present in that very difficult preposition in, so God is present everywhere because God is omnipresent, then God is present even in a so-called image, a so-called idol. So that in itself, I think, should help us to understand what is the theology of the Hindu image.
Okay,
Because once we start talking about God being omnipresent, then you can't say God is not somehow, with the emphasis on somehow, I don't know how. God is somehow present, even in this table in front of me. So when you talk like this, you will think, oh, you are going to worship the table. No, I never said that. I only said in, God is present in the table, somehow, in some form.
But yeah, as you said, there is a lot of debate, even in Islamic philosophy, a distinction between the creator and the created, or manifested or the manifested. Also, what would be one stereotype that you generally faced while being among Muslims that you want to address through this podcast, is that the Muslims change that stereotype, if there is any?
Well, I think we have already discussed quite a lot about one stereotype, that there is one particular understanding that all Hindus have about what is an idol. And this idol is an object made of stone, constructed with human hands, into which the absolute perfection of divinity has been squeezed into it. And God has become limited, and that object in front of them is the totality of God. So in that simple definition of idol worship, there is no idol worship in Hinduism. Let's put it this way. So what it is, then this is a very difficult question. We'll have a
next
whole
podcast on
we
that,
will
maybe.
we will have a whole book, and we'll have 20,000 footnotes and endnotes. But sometimes, just by saying what it is not, we can begin the conversation to what it is.
Interesting. So hopefully that is addressed in through this podcast. Now I want to move to the last section, is on religion and science. And currently there has been this debate after quantum mechanics came into being, and how the religious truth and science actually correlate. As you pointed out in one of your articles, where Keshav Chandra Sen argued that between God's vision and spirit of science, there was no discord but concord, because scientists too ardently love unity. So now we see this new trend going in, where sometimes religious scholars or religious preachers use scientific language. Some may say use, some may say abuse, to own that, okay, see, now the language of quantum mechanics, it's already telling what we were telling beforehand as well. How you look at this phenomenon of now, because when quantum mechanics came in, the Newtonian mechanics was a bit in doubt, and scientists were like, the religious preachers were like, okay, now, even in a Muslim culture, sometimes we have like, okay, you see, Miraj was because of Einstein's theory of E is equal to mc square. Given a philosopher of science and having a description, how do you look at it?
Yeah, so I think this is what's happening. Certain types of scientists, especially quantum physicists or cosmologists, are indeed looking for what sometimes is called a grand unified theory, a complete, a totalitarian or totalizing, rather, explanation of whatever there is in terms of three equations or two equations, or even better, one equation, right? So there is one singular absolute explanation for why there is anything, why there is something rather than nothing. And theologians and philosophers for centuries have been engaged in this kind of inquiry. there is a set of aphorisms in Hindu Vedantic theology called the Brahma Sutras, and it starts with this aphorism, therefore, then, this inquiry into Brahman. So what is the Brahman inquiry? The inquiry into the absolute foundation of what there is. And this particular text is, let's say, dated at about 200 BCE. So this text has been present for about 2 millennia now. This inquiry into the absolute foundation of what there is. And therefore, in that sense, it's right that scientists and metaphysicians and religious philosophers are all engaged in a quest for unity. But to go back to something I was saying right at the beginning of this podcast, that the language games are quite distinct. Because scientists use the language game of mathematics. Certain experiments have to be falsifiable, verifiable, replicable. Whereas these types of spiritual experiments are not falsifiable, verifiable, replicable in this ready-made manner. I say ready-made because I want to tell you, if you live with me, if I'm your guru for 15 years, you will go through all these stages and stations. And one day when your spiritual psychology is properly refined, you will begin to have these visions. But if you are going to tell me on day one, show me the vision. Unless you show me the vision, I will not receive initiation. Then I will say, well, then what can I do? Too bad. Because on day one, you will need to have this shraddha, this trust. Right? So if a religious philosopher or a Muslim is saying that this is my commentary on quantum physics from the perspective of Islam, then there's no problem with that. Because what you're doing, you are foregrounding your lens, your perspective. That this is not a reading that just any quantum physicist will give, but this is my reading when I'm reading quantum physics through the lens of the Qur'an, that this is what I see. Now, if that hermeneutic position is foregrounded right at the beginning, there will be no problem. But you may often find Muslims saying, whatever there is in the Quran is quantum physics and vice versa. Without saying that, I speak as a Muslim. That this is how I, as a scientist who happen to be a practicing Muslim, this is how I read quantum physics. There's no problem because, of course, you have to read it this way because there's no other choice but to say God is in everything. God is at the fundamental heart of quantum physics too. And that would apply also to a Hindu scientist, also to a Christian scientist.
But what would you say to Swami Jitmananda, who said that now physics has already entered the areas of Eastern mysticism through this detached observer, but is an active participant in the very process of his experimentation?
So again, I can't quite remember the text from which I cited this, but if he had highlighted this point that I made just now, that I, Swami, I write this as a practitioner of a certain style of Vedanta, and as a practitioner of this Vedantic metaphysics, I look at the world through this lens, then I would have no problem with that. But if what he's saying is that whoever is out there, without having any particular presupposition, should agree with this, then of course they won't. Because if you do not start from the presuppositions of Vedanta, where consciousness, being, reality are understood in a certain way, then why should you agree with this assessment?
In the sense is like you don't see many scientists saying that, okay, now what we found in physics is actually going back in religion.
And that is why.
But the religion people generally like, okay, now this is our claim. Finally, they said that word is illusion. We have been saying it long back ago.
And that is my point about your hermeneutic perspective. What is the hermeneutic perspective of many of these physicists? It's not religion. They start with their own understanding of metaphysical naturalism, space-time, reality, and so on. For them, whatever exists is in space and time and causation. Therefore, their hermeneutic perspective is very different from these religious philosophers. So once you highlight this point, that I'm not speaking as a scientist, I'm speaking as somebody who is writing a commentary on the Upanishads or the Quran or the New Testament, and therefore from my hermeneutic vantage point, this is how I read quantum cosmology or biology or ... all these different scientific fields. Then I think people will know where you come from, as we say. And then we'll say, okay, yes, this looks like a very interesting reading of the Brahma Sutras or the Upanishads.
Okay, interesting. So since we have talked about science, we have talked about religion, and in the current times when you have different things being handled by different sources of knowledge, like in ancient times, many of the explanation or the best possible explanation was given through these religious cosmological accounts, and many needs were taken care through religion. But in current times, as a theologian, what do you think religion has to offer to a modern man or a woman or a person?
So you have described me as a theologian, and I would say I do not quite see myself as a theologian. I see myself as a philosopher in the company of theologians.
Okay, so as a philosopher in the company of theologians, what do you think
Yeah.
religion
First,
has?
let me tell you what that means. So I study theological texts written by, say, Hindus primarily, and sometimes Muslims and Christians. And I read this text through a philosophical lens. I look for patterns of reason and rationality, questions of language, reality, being, consciousness. So this is what I mean, by the way, just to give you a comment on myself as a philosopher in the company of theologians, because there are many philosophers who do not like that company. So there are philosophers who are in the company of philosophers. No, nothing to do with theologians. But I'm deeply interested in what theologians do, and I read them. So what I will say to that question is a very interesting question, and I've thought about it for many years. This quest, the search for a non-fragmented vision of reality, a non-fragmented vision of the world. And to go back to a point I was making when I was telling you in the beginning, that I do not see the sciences and religion as sharply opposed, but placed on a conceptual continuum. So let's say I, in my own life, at the personal level, as a human being, am constantly in the process of bringing together different seemingly disconnected bodies of knowledge and trying to come up with a vision of my own. A vision of my own where I learn from others, learn sometimes even from revelation, and dot, dot, dot. So I would say that is work in progress, that we should continually carry out this work in progress without shutting down any doors by saying this is absolutely false. Maybe there's something we can learn from that perspective, from that angle.
But that we can learn from anything. But what's there in in reading about religion or religious tradition that we still need to do, which can't be done anywhere else? So what's there for
Yeah.
religion to offer to the problems or even the quest of a modern person?
So I would say this, that there are many people who seem to be quite okay without asking questions of the why category.
But I want to know your answer. What would
That-
your
that-
personal answer be?
That is my personal answer. As I was telling you in the beginning, I came into this field of inquiry called religion theology because I wanted to know why is there suffering in this world. If this world has been arguably created by a God of omnipresence, a God of great supreme compassion and love, why do we see so much suffering and evil in the world that seemingly makes no point to us, and to me definitely. And that why has continued to pester me to this day. I do not have a clear answer to that why that satisfies both my mind and my heart.
But has there been some comfort though?
There has been some comfort because I felt at some stages of my life that I found an answer that speaks to my mind, sometimes an answer that speaks to my heart. I have not been able to bring together these two dimensions in one answer, saying, here is an answer that speaks equally to my mind and heart. But to me, that why is very important. That if we are indeed living in a world that has been created by this God of great supreme love and compassion, then I'm not saying that there cannot be any suffering or evil. Maybe suffering and evil have a pedagogic function of soul making and all of that. But I'm talking about the seemingly horrific suffering that we see around us. We see little babies who are dying of cancer, and what possible good can come out of it. Right? So I want an answer to a very concrete question like that, like what is the good that is coming to the world or to us from a little girl, 3 years old, dying a painful death.
Putting this question to God and looking for the answers through the religious text.
No, I'm also putting the question to the religious text.
Religious text.
That give me a good explanation for this. And the answer that the religious text give, that at some point you will have to stop asking. And even that answer satisfies my heart. Because my point is not that with my finite human mind, I need to see the world as God does. I'm perfectly okay with the answer that at some stage human questing, human reasoning, explanation has to come to an end. Which is why I said I'm a philosopher in the company of theologians, not philosopher in the company of philosophers. A philosopher in the company of philosophers will not be happy with this answer, but I'm okay with this answer. But that answer satisfies my heart, but not my mind. Right? So my point is not that is the only why that I'm after. There are some other whys, but this is the most significant why religion matters to me, that these explanations that are given for why our seemingly mortal, finite lives are yet charged with meaning and value.
Interesting. So now the last question, which is a Thinking Islam question, which we ask every guest,
Okay.
is that what's your current question that you are thinking about these days? What is your question?
So one question that I'm thinking about is I'm now in the process of writing a book on bhakti. So, that's why I was telling you a while ago when you were asking me for my opinion or views on bhakti, I was like, how do I even begin to answer that question? I'm writing a book in 80,000 words. So now this book on bhakti has three main sections, and I'll tell you what the question is. So the first chapter is on some of the scriptural sources of bhakti, texts like the Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads, and Vedas. The second text is about the problem of the one and the many. So the one absolute foundation is Brahman, and yet here we are in a world populated by multiplicity. So how is this spatio-temporal diversity related to this absolutely one principle of unity? The third chapter is the chapter I'm writing. And this is the question that has been troubling me for, again, many, many years, which is this. On the one hand, many religious texts, they preach the language of love and harmony and equality and brotherhood and sisterhood. We are all brothers and sisters in the eye of the one Lord, the one God. But why is it that religious people seemingly have such a bad track record of actually implementing this gospel, this message of love and equality and peace and harmony? Because if it is indeed true that this is the message of Islam or Hinduism or Christianity, this message has been with humanity for 2 millennia, 3 millennia, at least 1,000 years. And yet, down these 1,000 years, we human beings do not seem to have made any significant progress. I'm using the phrase seem to because somebody will say, well, here is one example of it. And I agree. I mean, there are examples. But if you look at human history in the long durée, in the long range, even those spiritual islands of equality are few and far between. We seem to be surrounded by a vast ocean of inequality, hierarchy, hatred, and violence. Right? So why is it that religious traditions have such a bad track record of preaching of practicing what they preach? This is a question which is not just about Islam. I mean, it's a question of Hinduism in this particular case. I'm writing about Hindu bhakti. There's a language of Atman, a spiritual essence, Brahman, and there's a language of caste, there's a language of gender hierarchy. So how do these two vocabularies, how do they coexist in this uneasy tension in Hindu cultural spaces? That is not really a why in the sense of, okay, here is the answer in one sentence. Here is a question that I'm thinking through, grappling with, as I'm trying to write this chapter in about 18,000 words.
We look forward to reading this chapter and
this book.
And the book as well. And on this note, I thank you so much for this podcast, and hopefully the track record of religion improves with this dialogue.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I still have the advantage of asking the guests some more questions, but that doesn't mean our viewers don't have that advantage. So in case if you have any question, any comment, feel free to reach out to us through the comments or email us. And please subscribe and keep watching Thinking Islam. Just think about it.